Imagine you are sitting at a party. The lights are warm. Music plays just loud enough to fill the empty spaces. Around you, people are laughing, telling stories, weaving themselves into conversations as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And you are there. You hold your glass of water, lean your back against the wall, and watch everything. Not because you have nothing to say, not because you are shy or afraid of people, but because something inside you prefers to observe rather than to participate, prefers to understand rather than to be heard, prefers to see the whole painting rather than become one loud splash of color inside it. But then someone glances over at you and asks, "Why are you so quiet?" And that question, though asked in the most casual tone, touches something older and deeper, because you have heard it so many times before. Back in school, in group meetings, from people you once loved. From yourself, lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. Why am I so quiet? Why can I not just be a little more normal? And the strange thing is, you are never truly silent at all. Inside your head, everything is moving constantly. You noticed 15 minutes ago that the man standing over there is smiling, but his eyes are not smiling with him. You caught the way those two people keep avoiding each other's gaze, a familiar sign of a conflict that has never been resolved. You are processing, analyzing, filing away, and understanding all at once, while standing perfectly still, as if you are doing nothing at all. That is what the world does not understand about you. And perhaps that is also something you yourself have never been allowed to fully understand about yourself. In this video, we are not going to talk about how to overcome your silence, not going to discuss how to fit in better, not going to offer any advice along the lines of just talk more and you will be happier. Instead, we are going to go inward, into the real psychology behind people who observe in silence. And at the end of this video, there is a truth that I think will change the way you see yourself forever. Western philosophy has a very old concept, known as the examined life. Socrates once said that an unexamined life is not worth living. But what he didn't say is that in order to examine, you must stop. You must step outside the loud current of events and look back. And that is exactly what silent observers do. Not occasionally, but continuously, as a default state of being. But modern psychology does not call this philosophy. It gives it many different names. Some point to sensory processing sensitivity, the depth with which a person processes sensory information, a trait that psychologist Elaine Aron spent decades researching when she found that approximately 1/5 of the population processes environmental information more deeply, more slowly, and more subtly than the rest. Others connect it to Carl Jung's scale of introversion, who once wrote that introverts are not afraid of the outside world. They simply need to process that world internally before they respond. But both of those labels, I think, still fail to fully capture what a silent observer actually is. Because this is not just a story about introversion or sensitivity. This is a story about an entirely different way of approaching reality. Think about it this way. When you walk into a room, the world does not come to you as a flat image. It comes as a thick folder, layered with information stacked on top of information. The lighting, the temperature, the way people are standing, who is paying attention to who is trying to project something they do not quite feel. And your brain, rather than filtering most of that out the way most people's brains do, chooses to keep all of it. That is not a special ability in any mystical sense. That is simply how your nervous system operates, with a higher baseline level of cortical arousal, as neuroscientists describe when studying the brains of introverts. But here is the question that no one actually asks. If you are processing more, seeing more, and understanding more deeply, then why does the world look at you as though you are missing something? Why is your silence read as emptiness rather than fullness? Why is observation mistaken for non-participation? And this is where the story gets more interesting, because the answer does not lie in the world misreading you. The answer lies in the fact that the world was never designed to see what is happening on the inside. There are 3 deep psychological mechanisms that explain why silent observers are who they are, and why that is not a weakness, no matter how much the world wants you to believe it is. The first mechanism has to do with the way the brain processes social information. When you enter a conversation, there are 2 paths the human brain can take. The first path is to react immediately, to say the first thing that comes to mind, to join the flow of the conversation without stopping to filter or analyze. This path is fast. It consumes less cognitive energy, and it creates the impression of confidence, social ease, and warmth in connection. The second path, the path that silent observers follow in an unconscious and natural way, is to pause, to process, to compare what is being said with what is being implied beneath the surface, to place a potential response into a wider context before offering any reply at all. This path is slower, but it is closer to the truth. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, in his research on consciousness and emotion, once described how the human brain never processes information in just one direction. Every stimulus from the environment pulls along a wave of parallel processing, cognition, emotion, and memory, all operating at the same time. But most people block off the majority of that wave in order to respond more quickly. The silent observer does not. They let the whole wave run its course, and that is why they tend to say less, because when all of those layers are being processed simultaneously, language becomes too blunt an instrument to contain all of it. You are not silent because you have nothing to say. You are silent because you have too much being processed at once for any single sentence to hold it all. The second mechanism is what I call the paradox of presence. This is the strangest thing about silent observers. They are often the ones who understand most clearly what is happening in a room, yet they are also the ones who feel most invisible inside that room. They recognize other people's emotions before those people recognize them in themselves. They notice small fractures in relationships very early on. They hold on to details that others forget the moment they finish speaking. But because they do not voice those observations, do not insert themselves into the conversation, do not claim space with their voice, their presence is undervalued and sometimes denied entirely. This is where social psychologist Charles Cooley offers a useful lens. His theory of the looking glass self argues that our identity is largely shaped by the way others reflect our image back to us. You become what others see in you. But what happens when others cannot see enough of you to reflect anything back at all? What happens when your silence leaves people unsure of who you are, and because they do not know, they invent a version of you, and that version is almost always completely wrong. That you are arrogant, that you do not care, that you are sitting in quiet judgment, when in reality, you are listening more deeply than anyone else in the room. Being misunderstood is not a sign of social failure. Sometimes, it is simply the cost of operating at a frequency that others have not yet learned to hear. And this is the climax of the story. This is where 3 or 4 questions need to be placed in front of you all at once, not to be answered immediately, but to be felt for their full weight. Have you ever wondered why you know so much about other people, yet feel as though no one truly knows you? Have you ever noticed that you are gifted at reading a room, but have no idea how to read yourself? Have you ever felt that your observation is a gift you give to the world every single day, and the world never thanks you because it never even realized it received anything? And here is the final question, the one that everything before it has been preparing you to hear. If you have spent your whole life seeing other people clearly, when will you finally stop and see yourself? This is the third mechanism, and it is the deepest one of all. Silent observers often develop an extraordinarily refined skill for reading the external world, yet tend to remain blind to their own inner landscape, not because they lack emotional depth, but because the majority of their cognitive energy was directed outward from very early in life. Psychologist John Bowlby, in his research on attachment theory, pointed out that children who grow up in emotionally unstable environments often develop a state of heightened alertness toward their surroundings as a survival mechanism. They learn to read other people's moods in order to anticipate danger, to prepare the best possible response, to make it through evenings where the atmosphere at home could shift from calm to threatening in just a few minutes. That skill stays with you for the rest of your life. It refines itself, grows more complex, and becomes part of your personality. But it keeps its original nature intact, which is attention directed outward for the purpose of staying safe, not attention directed inward for the purpose of understanding yourself. And that is something many silent observers never realize about themselves, that they are not only observing because it is a purely intellectual instinct. Sometimes they observe because directing their attention toward the outside world feels safer than having to face the world within. Your silence is not always strength. Sometimes it is a distance you place between yourself and your own true feelings. So what do we do with all of this? Not change who we are, not become someone else, not learn to talk more so people will notice us, but rather learn how to redirect the observational instinct inward in a deeper and healthier direction. The first principle is to distinguish between observing and withdrawing. There is a subtle but very important difference between observing with intention and retreating from life out of fear. Intentional observation is when you choose to step outside the flow in order to see the full picture, and then step back in when you are ready, with clarity and purpose. Withdrawal is when you never step in at all, not because you do not want to, but because some quiet anxiety is keeping you at the edge. The question you can ask yourself is this: in the most recent moments, when you chose to observe rather than participate, was that a genuine choice, or was it an avoidance reflex? Sit with that question for a while. You do not need to answer it right away. The second principle is to learn how to redirect your observational ability inward. Silent observers are often very skilled at reading other people, yet they rarely apply that same quality of attention to themselves. Try this. At the end of each day, instead of analyzing the people you encountered, spend 10 minutes asking yourself the same questions you usually only ask about others. What today made me pull back? Which moment made me feel truly present? Was there something I wanted to say but did not, and why? Psychologist Carl Rogers called this unconditional positive self-regard, attention turned toward yourself without judgment. And that is something silent observers rarely give to themselves, even though they give it so naturally to everyone else. Imagine applying the same level of attention and compassion that you bring to understanding others toward understanding yourself. Just 10 minutes each night. The third principle is to learn how to take up space without surrendering who you are. One of the deepest pains of the silent observer is the feeling of having to choose between two things: either stay silent and remain invisible, or speak more and stop being yourself. But that is a false choice. Taking up space does not require volume. It can happen through presence, through the quality of what you say when you choose to say something, through the way you hold steady eye contact with someone when they are saying something that matters. Philosopher Martin Heidegger once said that language is the house of being, but he never said that house needs to be loud to be worth living in. Silence can be the most powerful form of language there is, as long as it comes from choice and not from fear. If you are watching this and something here has landed for you, leave a comment below. You do not need to write much, just one word or one sentence about what made you stop and stay. That is also a way to begin, to take up space in your own way, one small moment at a time. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is where conversations like this one happen regularly. No hype, no hollow inspiration, just the truth spoken slowly and honestly. The fourth principle is to pause and ask yourself whether you have been keeping a safe distance from your own life. This one is more subtle and a little more painful to look at directly. Silent observers often become very skilled at living on the periphery, not fully inside, not fully outside. They engage, but never fully surrender. They connect, but always keep a part of themselves held back. Like a photographer who always views life through a lens, always standing behind the camera, capturing everything, but never truly being part of the frame. And on some level, that feels comfortable. Because if you are never fully in, you cannot be fully hurt, but you also cannot be fully loved. And that is the real cost that no one mentions when they talk about the strength of the introvert. The question is not whether you are observing. The question is, while you are observing, is your own life passing by without you in it? And now, here is the final truth, the one I promised you at the beginning, and the one I think you are finally ready to hear. The greatest paradox of the silent observer is not that they are misunderstood. It is not that they are undervalued. The greatest paradox is that the person most capable of understanding others deeply is often the person who understands themselves the least. Not because they lack depth, but because they learned very early to direct all of their attention outward as a way of staying safe, and in doing so, they gradually became a stranger to themselves. The real strength of the observer does not lie in understanding others. It lies in the moment they turn that same gaze inward, with the same patience, the same absence of judgment, the same quiet and careful attention they have always given to the world outside, and finally see themselves. You do not need to speak more to be seen. You only need to see yourself first. Silence is not an absence. It is a presence the world has not yet learned to hear. And when you learn to hear yourself, you no longer need the world to understand you.